Welcome, everyone. You hear me?
Yes.
Nice. So good to see you. Thank you for coming out. And welcome to the second event in the inaugural Israel-Palestine Studies speaker series hosted by the Swig program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice. My name is Oren Kroll-Zeldin, and it is my honor and privilege to be a faculty member in the Jewish Studies and Social Justice program, where I teach courses, and I'm also helping to organize public events such as this lecture tonight. Let me begin by thanking a number of people who were involved and instrumental in making this event happen tonight. First and foremost, to the faculty and staff of the Swig program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice. Also, thank you to the Department of Theology and Religious Studies, as well as the Middle Eastern Studies program for co-sponsoring this event. I want to take a few minutes to let you know about a couple of other events that the Jewish Studies and Social Justice program is putting on this semester. The next one that's coming up is on Sunday, March 31st at 7 p.m. in McLaren. It's called a lecture called Intersectional Jewish Social Justice, Dismantling Racism and Anti-Semitism as an Unapologetic Jewish Black Woman. This is the 9th annual social justice lecture, JSSJ Social Justice Lecture. And for this lecture, Yavila McCoy will speak, and it will be followed up by a conversation with Noah Kushner, who is the founding rabbi of The Kitchen. Yavila McCoy is an educator, an activist, a spiritual teacher, and a Jewish woman and person of color who has designed numerous tools and methods that enable students and educators to be better citizens of the world through exploring differences and reaching for tangible solutions in allied engagement. She is a remarkable woman, and we are very lucky to be inviting her to campus March 31st at 7 p.m. Then on Monday, April 8th at 5:30 p.m., here in Fromm Hall, but over there in the Berman Room, will be the third and final event in the Israel-Palestine Studies speaker series. This will be a panel discussion called Gaza, Past, Present, and Future, which will be a discussion that features 3 Palestinian activists from Gaza who will together discuss the contemporary situation in Gaza and will share creative strategies to alleviate the humanitarian crisis in this coastal enclave. If you'd like to learn more about the Jewish Studies and Social Justice program, in the back of the room, or maybe it's the front of the room because it's where you walked in, there are little green packets that will tell you a lot more about what we do both in the classroom and out of the classroom. And if you want to get onto our mailing list, we send maybe 1 email a month. There's a sign-in sheet, but that's different from the student sign-in sheet. So students, if you want to get on the list, sign your email as well. Through the Swig Jewish Studies and Social Justice program, we believe that education is the best long-term way to create systemic change. Whether one has the time to take a semester-long course or a few hours to hear from a single speaker, education is fundamental to making our world better, paramount in shining the spotlight on the margins, on oppressed communities who are mistreated merely because of their race, ethnicity, religion, gender, sexual orientation, or another social identity altogether. And now let me introduce the speaker for tonight. Dr. Marik Shtern earned his PhD at Ben-Gurion University and is currently a postdoctoral scholar at UC San Diego. Additionally, he works as a researcher at the Jerusalem Institute for Israel Studies, where his field of research is the geography of Jewish-Arab relations in Jerusalem. He is an urban geographer with an expertise in the geography of intergroup encounter, urban politics, and Jewish-Palestinian relations. Since 2010, Marik has been very active in the fields of social and political change in Jerusalem. He was one of the founding members of Yerushalmim, a pluralistic urban movement, Hashgacha Pratit, alternative kosher system, and other social initiatives. He is also an active member of the Shacharit Institute, through which he has founded a group of Israeli Russian-speaking activists called Generation 1.5 that has challenged the public discourse on Russian Israelis through successful social media campaigns. After Dr. Shtern's lecture, we'll have an opportunity to ask him questions, so please stay for that, and we will engage with a conversation with Dr. Shtern. And now it's my pleasure, please join me in welcoming Dr. Shtern to the University of San Francisco.
Thank you, Owen. You hear me from this distance? Okay. Hi, everyone. Good evening. So thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to come and speak to you. Just a kind of personal background. Since I was 2 years old, I've been living in Jerusalem, and I was always intrigued, since I was quite young, by this ongoing tension between, and it's not only me, but many of us that grew up in Jerusalem, between what it seems as quite a tough, heavy, and sometimes very cruel city on one hand, and between a feeling of loyalty to the city, patriotism, fascination, and sometimes even the thought that it's actually a great place to be in. And it was kind of very contradicting thoughts that I think involve a lot of people who live in Jerusalem. But of course, my understanding of the city is quite different as an Israeli Jew than what a Palestinian from East Jerusalem I describe of what it is Jerusalem, what it is the daily life in Jerusalem for him. And power relations are having a very significant role in the understanding that we have of the city of very different angles. And one of the things that I think are a point of time in which you see those two different points collide would be those places in which Jews and Arabs find themselves together. And I'm not talking about the dialogue groups or any kind of intended attempt to bring people together, but actually kind of circumstantial, I would say, encounter. For example, a workplace where Jews and Arabs find themselves working together, a shopping mall, a park, and etc. And then it's kind of always hard to understand, if you look at this scene, for example, is this real? What does it mean that those two groups sit in one next to the other? They're not really communicating. On one hand, we see ultra-Orthodox Jews, on the other, Palestinian Muslims. They sit on the stairways of a mall, shopping mall called Mamila. Is it something that is false, that kind of hides behind it the real reality of Jerusalem, or does it carry its own essence, or even a promise for something better? This has become kind of the focus of my study eventually, to understand those geographies of encounter, those encounters themselves, and their meaning to the city, but also to the people who find themselves cohabiting the same place. Now we'll go deep to one of the more tough points about the city, and this is a picture of kind of a presentation of power of one of the racist Jewish organizations that are active in Jerusalem. They are called Le'ava. Le'ava in Hebrew is flame, and it goes for an organization that fights against romantic connections between Muslim and Jews. Mostly, in most cases, we're talking about Muslim men and Jewish women. And what's written on the board that they're holding is the girls of Israel to Israeli people, something like that. Basically, along this agenda that they have, which is based in some aspect on the Jewish religion, they also foster a lot of other racist practices. And the fact that they are standing here at the central square of West Jerusalem, it's called the Zion Square. It's kind of the main point at the city center of Jewish part of Jerusalem. They're standing there at Thursday nights, sometimes Saturday nights, where the place is packed of people going out. And they try to intimidate Palestinian bypassers and of basically trying to scare them away and drive them back to East Jerusalem. And I will get back to this organization. And during the summer, when they did this kind of power presentations, I used to go there also to talk to some of those kids, because we see it's like 14, 15-year-old kids, to understand what leads them to cooperate with such an organization. But also we had some of us activists were standing there trying to be witness if we see any wrongdoing and call the police in any case. And on my way in one of these nights, on my way to Zion Square, on Ben Yehuda Street, I encountered a kind of total different scene. This is a circle of breakdance. You probably know, they stand around and every time someone else is going in the middle and do his thing. And what was interesting, that half of the people there were Palestinians that were working in a gym just standing next by, behind that. This is like 300 feet from the Zion Square, from where Le'ava is standing at the same time. And they're doing this kind of cultural thing together. And actually, you can't see it, but the guy that's dancing in the middle is a Jew. He's wearing a shirt with a symbol of the IDF, of one of the units in the IDF. And easily some of those young fellows standing around there can be working with this organization of Le'ava or volunteering them. And what I'm trying to understand is, how does it work out? How can city contain those two realities, and what does it mean? I'm trying to relate it from a theoretical point of view. So going back to theory on the geopolitical study of Jerusalem, mainly we see three approaches which I want to relate to them. One of them looking at Jerusalem as a nationally contested city, then a colonial city, and an ordinary city. And I would like to elaborate a bit more about them. So the first approach, which was quite predominant during the 1990s, during the Peace Oslo Accords, was looking at Jerusalem as a place on which two national movements, the Israeli Zionists, the State of Israel, and the Palestinians, are fighting one against the other over who will control Jerusalem, who will have Jerusalem exclusively or not exclusively for his own, and who will build his own capital there. At the same time, of course, Israel already had a capital there and Palestinians didn't. But if you look at this kind of point of view of a rivalry between two national movements, then usually you will compare Jerusalem to other nationally contested cities like Belfast, Nicosia, for example, in which you have those national movements fighting against each other until it reaches kind of a solution. So there is an assumption here of an equal power balance, in a way, between two groups, that eventually it will lead up to some kind of solution or a resolution. And those scholars like Bollens, Kliot and Mansfeld or Klein were looking at border regimes, at segregation patterns, at urban planning, and etc. And if you look at the map, Jerusalem is standing on the center of the West Bank as part of a future solution. Later on, a decade afterwards, especially after the collapse of the Peace Oslo Accord and the eruption of the Second Intifada, we see a new attitude which is becoming more and more predominant. It was existing before, mainly among Palestinian scholars, but now it took hold among other Israeli critical scholars, which were saying that this is not a national rivalry. What we see is actually colonial relations between the Israeli state and the Palestinian subject in Jerusalem, especially in East Jerusalem. And then we need to discuss Jerusalem in terms of urban ethnocracy or a colonial city and etc. And if we need to compare Jerusalem, we'll compare it to apartheid time, Johannesburg, or even European colonial cities in the 19th century. Most of the focus of this scholarship looks at the occupation, at the dynamic of power, at the suffer of the Palestinian people in East Jerusalem, and at structural segregation. So this is quite a dominant point of view until today. And if you look at this map, it's quite representational because you don't see West Jerusalem in this map. You see only East Jerusalem and beyond it. So it actually kind of reflects this new focus of what's going on in East Jerusalem. The last approach, which is actually the most minor one, is let's discuss Jerusalem as an ordinary city. Let's discuss urban phenomena that take place in any kind of Western or Middle Eastern city. Let's talk about neoliberalism. Let's talk about immigration, emigration, the right to the city, like you would do in San Francisco, for example, and etc. And then you can compare Jerusalem to other Israeli Western city or even Middle Eastern cities. And what I tried to do in my dissertation, at least, was saying that, in fact, in order to understand phenomena in Jerusalem, especially in West Jerusalem, but not only, we probably will have to relate to all prisons because they are all part of the reality of Jerusalem. You have the colonial dimension, you have the national rivalry dimension, and you also have ordinary life in Jerusalem. And now those realities, they have some hierarchy between them. They are not equal. And it also depends on where and when you're looking at. Right? If you would look at in some Palestinian neighborhoods in East Jerusalem, of course, the colonial reality will be the most dominant one. It wouldn't be over-encompassing. It's not the total. Even there, you can find ordinary life and also national resistance and etc. But still, you will have domination. If you go to West Jerusalem, you would see other layers emerge as more evident in some cases. So this is what I've called a multidimensional analysis. My methodology was also kind of mixed as my theory. It combined quantitative and qualitative studies. I did 3 surveys in 3 cases of encounters. One of them, the first one, were shopping malls, which kind of pumped up as the first post-Oslo new spaces of encounter, actually these shopping malls. The second one was workplaces. 50%, almost 50% of Palestinians in East Jerusalem are employed in West Jerusalem. If you count the number of Jews which are employed in East Jerusalem, you can count them maybe in 2 hands. This is a total asymmetrical economic relations. Palestinians today, the whole Palestinian community are totally dependent on the Jewish sector as a source of income. And going to work would be the first reason why you would see Palestinians in West Jerusalem. Okay? So we're talking about a structural dependency, but also on the other side, there are whole sectors of industry in West Jerusalem which are today totally dependent on Palestinian workforce. For example, tourism. 75% of the workers in hotels in West Jerusalem come from East Jerusalem. The drivers, the public transportation drivers, electricity and etc. But most of the blue collar work in today's West Jerusalem and service work is done by Palestinians. And this context is very important to understand what we're going to discuss. And the last case which I studied was a case of a mixed neighborhood, which is actually a settlement in East Jerusalem called the French Hill, in which, in a very surprising way, a place which was built to Judaize East Jerusalem has become the first mixed Jewish-Arab neighborhood after an immigration of middle-class Palestinians into this neighborhood. So before I go down to the case studies, and I'm not going to speak about all of them, it's very important to understand the geopolitical background of this story and the shifting municipal boundaries and borders of Jerusalem. So if we go back to 1948, which is kind of the axis point in time for what we discuss here, the city was, after the 1948 war, the city was divided between two countries. West Jerusalem in blue was become the new capital of the state of Israel, 1948. You see it in blue. And what we call today East Jerusalem, some parts of it are in green, became a Jordanian city, Jordanian Jerusalem, not the capital of Jordan. Jordan had a different capital in Amman. And you can see that we discussed quite small towns in both cases, very concentrated towns. Both of them suffered from being divided, from being at the end of a border. Their economy slowed down. If you take any kind of city and divide it into two, you create damage all over in both sides. It's very hard to function. You have to create dual infrastructure and etc. And there was almost no movement between the two parts of the city. In 1967, when Israel occupied the West Bank, Gaza, and the Golan Heights, it occupied also Jordanian East Jerusalem. Now, in contrary to the West Bank and Gaza, a few days after the war, the Israeli government decided to annex East Jerusalem, bring it under its civic rule. Now, this annexation was not recognized almost by any country in the world. I think by any country in the world, maybe none of them, maybe the United States will be the first, you never know. But according to Israeli law, there is a difference between East Jerusalem and the West Bank. West Bank being kept under military rule, and East Jerusalem is considered as part of the rule of the civic rule of Israel. Now we see that Israel has drew a new municipal border. This is in orange, which was much larger than both Jerusalems that existed before. Now with this new boundary was created not out of any kind of urban logic. And in fact, it wasn't urban planners who sat down and delineated this border. The people who sat down were generals from the Israeli army. Few days after the war, they decided where would be Jerusalem, where would be the boundaries of the annexation of Jerusalem. And this military logic reflected in the fact that they tried to include within Jerusalem hills that control topographically the old city. So we see this kind of military thinking. If we're going to have another war in the future, we should occupies those hills, and then we have a better strategic position. At the same time, they tried not to include as much as Palestinian concentration of population in those new boundaries. So the logic went between as much as territory as we can, as less Palestinian as possible. But it wasn't totally possible, and they did include around 26 Palestinian villages that weren't part of Jerusalem before 48 and now included within the new border, like the village of Shoafat, Beit Hanina, Tzor Bacher, Jabal Mukaber, which are today considered Palestinian neighborhoods in East Jerusalem. The last line that is important to know is the separation wall, built in 2005, from around 2005, some parts of it a bit later. This is in black. I will explain a bit more about the effect of this wall, but it kind of created facts on the ground, much more division than before between East Jerusalem and the West Bank. So what used to be a political boundary between East Jerusalem, the orange line, was now a solid physical border between those parts. And this process is very important to understand in relation to the status of East Jerusalem. Until the end of the 80s, even under Israeli occupation, East Jerusalem continued to function as the center of the metropolis of the West Bank. Meaning if Palestinians in surrounding villages and towns of Ramallah, Bethlehem, usually the place they would, the political center of their area would be Jerusalem, the social, the economic center, the touristic center. Most of the hotels were in East Jerusalem. People would come to work in Jerusalem, come to pray in Al-Aqsa. Of course, Jerusalemites lived in many ways from the fact that it is the center of this metropolis and people are coming from all around from its Palestinian hinterland. From the beginning of the 90s until the construction of the wall, we see in steps this movements toward division. It began with closures, which are temporary, which for a week or two, Israel shut down all the entrances, all the roads to East Jerusalem from the West Bank. The Oslo Accords, which were peace negotiations, actually reinforced this kind of division by putting checkpoints on the roads leading to Jerusalem. Now, everyone who wanted to enter Jerusalem from the West Bank had to obtain a permit. They didn't need to have a permit before. Now they have to show that they actually can come and work in Israel, meaning from that point on, much less people entered East Jerusalem from the West Bank. And this process is, I would say, definite seal off was the construction of the wall, which became a physical boundary along this line between East Jerusalem and the West Bank. So in fact, this wall in Jerusalem separates not between Jews and Arabs, but between Palestinians of East Jerusalem and Palestinians living in the West Bank, which is important to understand. In other parts of the country, it does separate between Jews and Arabs. Now, the creation of the wall creates a kind of an earthquake in East Jerusalem. What is it? It disturbs all ways of life. It cuts some neighborhoods in the middle. Some part of the neighborhoods were left beyond the wall, like Kafar Aqab or Shuafat refugee camp. You got these awkward situations in which Palestinians, which are residents of Jerusalem, are now actually living beyond the wall, need to cross a checkpoint into entering every time to the city, but they're not under the Palestinian Authority, they're still under Israeli rule, and they are kind of caught in those enclaves which are now full of poverty and marginalization and a lot of humanitarian problems. That's on one hand, so there's a lot of suffering created because of the war. On the other hand, and you can use this metaphor, the Palestinians have found themselves standing with the back to the wall, the Palestinians of East Jerusalem. Now, what they saw in front of them in many ways was West Jerusalem. So on the other hand, you see a process of Israelization caused by the wall. For example, a colleague of mine, his name is Ahmad, he worked with me, he said he was the first one going to the Hebrew University in his family, which was considered a total taboo until that point because of the construction of the wall. He said, I wouldn't go to a Palestinian university. I don't know, I'll go each time going back and forth will take hours. I don't want to be caught be outside of Jerusalem. It's much easier to get to university in this city. But also in terms of which kind of labor market I'm going to integrate as a professional worker, not as a manual worker. Suddenly you have a rise in the demand for Hebrew classes, in the demand for Israeli citizenship, which I'll explain, open quotes. Palestinians in East Jerusalem are not citizens of Israel. They were left with a status of permanent residency, which is quite different. It's kind of a second degree citizen, you might say, but Palestinians can have the option to apply individually for Israeli citizenship in East Jerusalem. Until the 2000s, this was considered as a betrayal in the Palestinian idea. If you go and ask for Israeli citizenship, you kind of give up for the Palestinian struggle over the city. But since the construction of the wall, we see a rise in those applications for people saying, at least if we are caught, we don't know what would be the future. We can be kicked out also from the city as a residence. We might as well take this citizenship status, and this what will keep us in Jerusalem and will secure our own independent future. If we look at East Jerusalem today, almost 40% of Jerusalem residents live in East Jerusalem, 38%. 75% living below the Israeli poverty line. 30% are school dropouts. There is an ongoing and quite structural discrimination in allocation of any kind of municipal budget in East Jerusalem if you compare it to Jewish West Jerusalem. And there is an ongoing resistance to the Israeli control over the city, which is quite unique to East Jerusalemites if you compare them to other Palestinians living in Israel, like Palestinians in Haifa or Palestinians in the Galilee. For example, Palestinians of North, what we call Israeli Palestinians or Palestinian citizens of Israel, they do vote for the parliament, they have parties in the parliament, they work in the Israeli labor market, they go to Israeli university. This has been the custom in the last decades. East Jerusalem Palestinians, although they were expected to adopt the same kind of attitude towards Israel, since '67, they continue to resist as much as they can not to normalize the occupation in East Jerusalem. So if they could, they wouldn't go to the Hebrew University. They have the right to vote in the municipal election, but until today, they choose not to do that because voting means normalization. And they try to keep a very strict social and political boundary between them and Israeli space. And again, what we see is that those boundaries are being challenged, I would say, in the last decade in post-Oslo Jerusalem because of the construction of the wall and the demise of the Oslo Accords. On the other hand, to go to West Jerusalem, some parts of it look like any kind of, I even would say European city, if you would like to say a Mediterranean city. 500,000 people live in West Jerusalem, 99% of them are Jews. Only 26% live below poverty line, so it's also not a small figure, but again, you see the difference between the two parts of the city. It has gone through considerable urban renewal in the last decade. There's also a lot of tensions between the population, the Jewish population, and a growing religious majority within the Jewish population. And the fact that the organization that we discussed, Le'ava, for example, is gaining kind of presence in West Jerusalem is because of the changing demography among the local Jewish population. And they also, all of them have Israeli citizenship. So this is just to point out the differences between two parts of the city and the conditions. So going back, since in post-Oslo Jerusalem, in East Jerusalem, we see those two trends. On one hand, Israelization, as I already mentioned, Hebrew University, you can see here, and the Israeli passport, but at the other end, and sometimes the same person can do both ways. You see more Palestinization, meaning a growing sentiment towards Al-Aqsa, a growing sense of peoplehood. And in 2014, 2015, there was a wave of violent, I would say, resistance among Palestinian, mostly youth, in East Jerusalem against Israeli army, against Israeli police, also against Israeli citizenship. And for the first time, you saw a wave of resistance that actually started in East Jerusalem and was carried by East Jerusalemites almost solely. And we call the name for those waves is usually the Intifada. There was the first Intifada in the 80s, the second Intifada in the 2000s. In both cases, until now, East Jerusalemites played a minor role in the resistance. Most of the attacks came from the West Bank, but now we actually see Palestinians from East Jerusalem taking a more leading role in resistance towards the Israeli regime. Before I go that, I'll go here. So if we look at this geography of encounter, and we take in fact, the conditions that I discussed, that most of Palestinians who come to West Jerusalem do that because they don't have any other choice. It's forced upon them, this kind of boundary crossing, out of economical dependency and so on. Also for the Jews in West Jerusalem who are being taught, or they grow up with this kind of understanding of Palestinians as enemy, as something we should fear from, they are also being kind of forced into this encounter. It's totally asymmetric, this geography of encounter, because most of it, and you would say, if you look at the map, those areas with the black points, you would see that most of the places in which Jews and Palestinians are meeting each other as citizens are in West Jerusalem. So in essence, this is a place where Jews feel at home and Palestinians feel as strangers or alienated. And again, this is the context. So it's enforced, it's asymmetrical. In many cases, not always, it's stratified. If you look at workplaces, in most of those, in workplaces where Jews and Arabs work together, Jews would be the bosses or the medium and high scale directors, and Palestinians would be in the lower strata. And what is also important, that it's unplanned. Jerusalem is planned for division. The rationale of urban planning in Jerusalem since '67, and it's the same case in many kind of mixed cities in Israel, there is a concrete strategy of separation between various populations. And if we look, for example, at the Jerusalem Outline Plan of 2000, this is the last official document point out on the strategy of Jerusalem municipality for the city. It has a very peculiar understanding of multiculturalism. It says, in a multicultural city such as Jerusalem, spatial segregation of various population groups in the city is a real advantage. Every group has its own cultural space and can live its lifestyle. The segregation limits the potential source of conflict between and among the various populations. So I think that you wouldn't find this kind of document in any other city in the world that actually celebrates segregation between different populations in the city and see it as an aim to strive for. And this is important to understand, that the city is not ready in a way to contain those kind of growing encounters between Jews and Arabs, and also not the population themselves. Any questions? It's a lot of information, I know, so if you need to understand something in a more deeper level, you can ask. So one of the case studies which I want to a bit more elaborate was the shopping malls, which is a very interesting site. Now, if you look at literature on shopping malls in the academia and etc., we are very critical towards shopping malls. We talk about shopping malls in a sense of the demise of the public sphere in the city, something very superficial, consumerism. We used to hang out in the public sphere and talk to each other. Now all we do is go and shop together, and etc. But in the context of Jerusalem, I found out that actually shopping malls are creating opportunities, interesting ones. And I took two shopping malls. One is called Mamila and the other Malcha. Interesting enough, these are two Palestinian names of those locations. There are two Palestinian neighborhoods, and one is the neighborhood, one is a village that existed in Jerusalem prior to 1948. Palestinians were forced out of those localities during the war, and eventually they become part of Jewish West Jerusalem. What is peculiar a bit is that although they tried to change the names of those neighborhoods, it didn't succeed. And Jerusalemites are still using, even Jews, the original Palestinian names of those locations. So one mall is Malcha Mall on the left. You see the red point. It's kind of deep in West Jerusalem, although it's close to the Green Line. Okay, you see that. So this is Malcha, You see, it's close to the Green Line, but it's mostly surrounded by Jewish neighborhoods on both sides of the line. It was the first mall opened in Jerusalem, 1993. It is still the most successful mall in the city and even in Israel in general. The other mall is Mamila Mall, you see it on the right side, built straight on the seam line between East and West Jerusalem, near the old city. And the location has a lot of meaning here. Now, I interviewed the directors of those malls, and I also did my field survey, and we discovered very interesting things. In both cases, the directors mentioned that when they constructed the mall, they thought that the main market would be middle-class Jews, and they found out eventually that they have a big crowd of Palestinian customers, so they had to adapt to this change of demography in the mall. And one interesting occasion kind of highlighted this situation. It was during 2014. There was a war in Gaza, and during the months of those war, Palestinians from East Jerusalem stopped coming to the malls in West Jerusalem. There was one reason for that is that they didn't want to shop in Jewish businesses while the things that go on in Gaza and etc. going on, so out of solidarity. The other reason is also they didn't feel safe to go to West Jerusalem during this time of tension and violence. And in the newspaper that I saw an article about this issue, they mentioned that Malchamol has a decrease of 20% in his revenue during this period of time. And 20% is quite a considerable number if you have it suddenly. And then Malchamol management decided to launch this campaign in East Jerusalem, calling them to come for spring sales. And they say in Arabic that your happiness is here, and it's kind of natural consumerist language, as you see, even the photograph and etc. They tried to publish it in Palestinian newspapers in East Jerusalem, but they were declined. The newspaper didn't want to put those ads, so eventually they just spread it around, I think, as printed material. But the fact that they are campaigning in East Jerusalem, and they see East Jerusalem as a potential or important market. Now, we have to put aside, this is a very cynical move, of course. They only want the money of the Palestinians. But suddenly, you have an actor in West Jerusalem which is fostering mixing, which is going against the logic of the city of separation and tries to draw Palestinians to the places which has become the city square, the new city square of the city. Because where do people hang out today? Mostly, even in the States or in any kind of place, it would be the mall. So it's quite a significant place. When I interviewed the Mamila Mall manager and I asked him what his position about the Palestinian customers and etc., he mentioned that 60% of his sales personnel in the shops are Palestinians from East Jerusalem. So most of the people working in the shop are coming from East Jerusalem. And he explained it, and you see the quote, "I have many Arab workers in the shops. It's in purpose. It's because I want the Arabs that come to the shops to feel at ease when one of their own is serving them. It was tremendously successful, and it reflected not only in sales, but also in the fact that there is no vandalism or destruction of any kind." So again, a very cynical quote. We see this kind of very capitalistic approach within the context of the conflict of Jerusalem. But we also see another stage of this development. It's not only the customers, the management encourages the shops to hire Palestinians because they can speak both languages and they can serve the Palestinian customers. So the mixture is multi-layered now, also among the customers and the workers. And this is also a picture I took at Mamila Mall, which is very strange. It's Columbia shop, which you know, the chain Columbia clothing, and it's written in Hebrew to all, and then in big letters in Hebrew and small letters in Arabic. It says to all our customers who celebrate Eid al-Fitr, a Muslim holiday, And it says big in Hebrew, Chag Sameach, which is happy holiday. It's something, a blessing you would say in Hebrew for a Jewish holiday. Now it's interesting. First of all, on one hand, you have an acknowledgement of a kind of paying respect to a religious custom of the Palestinians, which is unique in West Jerusalem. On the other hand, it's written in Hebrew. And we see this interplay of trying to go with and feel without. As you know, the saying, they couldn't do it in big letters in Arabic because then it would be too kind of in your face for the Jewish customers. So they wrote it in Hebrew. And again, we see how those capitalist players try to dance between the drops. Now, when customers comes to shop, even if it's among the same kind of group, you don't really have interactions between people. It's mostly cohabitation, and maybe you see each other, which might also be significant in kind of a normal position. But what goes on between the workers, in my analysis, it's much more significant. Because there you suddenly have people working side by side for long hours every day. Now, until the 90s, Palestinians used to work in West Jerusalem. It was the same kind of 40% in 81. I encountered this number once. But all of the Palestinians working in West Jerusalem worked almost totally in two sectors, construction and industry. Both of them kind of very blue collar. Now, when you work in construction and industry, you usually don't meet Jews or Israelis. It's kind of behind the scene. When you work in shop, first of all, you work intensively with Jewish workers, and also you meet all the time Jewish customers. So you have much more intense interaction with Israeli space. Now, a big question arises here: what kind of power relation dynamics you have in those kind of workplaces? And I interviewed many Palestinian and Jewish workers. So you have one phase of a factory, for example, in which all the hard workers are Palestinians and the Jews would be the boss. And then Palestinians, which are interviewed in such conditions, would say, like, you know, we only meet him once in 3 hours. It doesn't matter. It only leads to more frustration and hatred and resentment in many ways. It goes on to reproduce the same power relations. But when you talk to those people working actually in those shops, young people from both sides working together in the same position, and sometimes in some of those shops also the Palestinians would be the directors of the shops, and they would be the one employing the Jews. You have a kind of a temporary change in the power dynamics that, again, in my analysis, does create new options, and you can see it in some of the quotes I collected. And this is an ultra-Orthodox woman working in one of the shops in Mamila, a young woman, and she says, at the beginning, I was terribly worried because it was the first time I'm working with Arabs, and it's the first time I encountered them at work, not as a manual worker or someone who came to repair the house. So I was worried, but it went well. They are nice, very likable human beings. Now, again, this sounds like a very naive, even, I don't know how a statement, but also if you kind of look at it in different angle, you have a moment of humanization that took place in this shop, of actually looking at the person that you have a very clear stereotype and changing it. And she also mentioned, I didn't bring the quote, that they have a beginning of social relations between those groups, and they were planning to go into this amusement park a week afterwards, some of the Jewish and the Arab workers together. A different quote came from a Palestinian worker in a different mall in our time, late. Okay, yeah. And she said, it's a Palestinian, the name was La, and she says, in our shop, we are half Arabs and Jews, Until then, I only met Jews at checkpoints or at airports. It was a state of racism. I want people to be more open one to another. And then she said, a lot of Arabs go to the mall, but they don't really know the Jews, and the Jews don't know them at all. So again, it's kind of, and of course, this is very important. When I try to figure out the influence of the encounter, Jews and Arabs were influenced differently from the fact that they are meeting each other. In many cases, Palestinians actually, from working in West Jerusalem, even as doctors or professional work, became even more frustrated and developed even more negative feeling about their own condition, because eventually at the end of the work, they had to go back to East Jerusalem to face the realities of occupation. And for them, it was, a kind of, so what? When I interviewed Jews, I actually had different reactions that most of the cases mentioned a positive influence of this kind of encounter with Arabs at this a more equal position, especially in that cases where it was more equal. So again, you see how the power dynamics plays out differently also during the encounter itself. And back to Le'ava, Flame Organization. This is a pamphlet that's spread out in the city square where I encountered them. And it says, this is kind of a mock invitation for a wedding of Muhammad and Michal. Muhammad being a Muslim name, Michal it is a Jewish name, Jewish Israeli name. And they say, if you don't want that the invitation for your daughter's marriage to look like that, so don't go and shop in shops which hire enemies, which employ enemies. So again, we see how this kind of new situation plays out among the radical right, radical Jewish right, as a danger to the Jewish integrity, to the Jewish character of Jerusalem. And sometimes I think to understand a phenomena, you need to understand who fights against it, to position it in the political reality. And this is also a map. This organization is spread. This is the Machne Yehuda market. It's kind of vegetable market. And it's portraying in which stalls they employ Arabs, kind of, a moral navigation for the Jew. Don't shop here, shop there, etc. So again, you see how they fight against this same trend. Now I'll try to go on. I don't have enough time, but I wanted to discuss also the French Hill as a unique example of a mixed neighborhood. And if I can, I'll try to push it in 5 minutes. So the French Hill, you can look at it from this position, was one of the first Jewish settlements built in East Jerusalem out of the big project of Judaizing East Jerusalem by constructing neighborhoods for Jews and eventually leading to the immigration of around 200,000 Jews into East Jerusalem. Today, almost half of the Jewish population of Jerusalem are living in one of those neighborhoods in East Jerusalem. So it's a total political project, this neighborhood. Now, again, during the Second Intifada, in the beginning of the 2000s, the security situation in this neighborhood has deteriorated, and we saw that the original population that were living in this neighborhood, which were mostly secular and liberal Jews, actually living because it's close to the university, started leaving the neighborhood, and two new populations entered. On one hand, you had Israeli Palestinians, meaning not Palestinians from East Jerusalem, but Palestinians coming from the north of Israel to work and study in Jerusalem, and they prefer to live in a Jewish neighborhood in East Jerusalem than in East Jerusalem itself because of the higher conditions, the better life conditions in this neighborhood. And on the other end, you had ultra-Orthodox Jews entering the city from other neighborhoods. Now, I don't want to make it too complicated. You need a lot of background to understand the relationship between those groups. But I would only want to highlight one quote further. There is a very interesting site in the neighborhood, the commercial center, in which you would see a lot of those type of encounters and etc. But a very unique community has been developed in this neighborhood, and with this I'll try to close up. It's called Ma'an Yachad. It's a group of secular Jews, mostly kind of upper middle class liberal Jews who live in this neighborhood settlement, and Israeli Palestinians who decided to create a new community. Ma'an Yachad means together in Arabic and Jewish, the bilingual community of the French Hill. The idea is to open a Jewish Arab school in the neighborhood in 2014. They weren't quite successful in that. They did manage to introduce Arab classes into the local Jewish school, in which most of the Palestinian children are going to in this neighborhood. But the way they are meeting and collaborating together is actually celebrating Jewish, Muslim, and Christian holidays together. This is an invitation for Hanukkah and Christmas. Many of those Palestinians are Christians, but not all of them, they are Muslim. And this is very interesting because all of them are secular from both sides. And you can see that only secular Jews and secular Muslims and secular Christians would be able to celebrate these holidays together, which is considered like an abomination, I would say, at least in the Jewish Orthodox side. But the fact that they relate to each other, and this is just the ending of a bigger case study, is that they share a same kind of class, upper middle class, as educated Jews and Arabs in these Jewish Arab settlements. And you can see, in a way, in this picture, it's very hard to recognize which one of them is Jewish, which one of them is Palestinian. And this happened in this kind of settlement. Now, the big question is, so what? On one hand, we see that there is growing tendency towards more spatial mixing between Jews and Arabs in West Jerusalem. And we see that in some cases, at least temporarily, there is a positive potential that rises in those regions. Does it challenge the bigger geopolitical picture? I wouldn't say, at least not in the concrete situation. I mean, those people eventually go back to their houses, to their homes, to the same conditions as they used before. But it does, I think, teach us about the complexity of urban reality in Jerusalem on one hand, the fact that you have this kind of layers of colonial, contested, and ordinary that intermingle, that interplay with each other. So it's kind of, I would say, a more complex situation that's usually described in the literature. A second thing that arises from this research is the fact that usually neoliberalism and those new spaces are very kind of neoliberal, like shopping malls, like the fact that people prefer the quality of life to live in the French Hill and not in East Jerusalem. It's kind of very neoliberal discourse. The fact that Palestinians are putting forth their own independent survival and engaging into Israeli social space. But if we look at the shopping mall, for example, it has been described in common literature as a place of exclusion, or at least class-based exclusion, a place where you can enter. And we actually see that in the context of Jerusalem, it has become an exclusive place for ethnic or ethno-national interaction. And it does teach us about this more complex, I would say, relationship between neoliberalism and colonialism, as it normally described. So thank you. It was a bit squeezed and a lot of information, and you're invited to ask questions.
Thank you very much. Questions?
Thank you. That was very interesting. Could you talk a little bit about the power dynamics within the old city of Jerusalem, within the walled city? What's happening there?
In the old city?
Yeah.
So the old city is quite a very different space. First of all, it's very close to the holy places, and you have the most religious populations living around the basin. And I would say that this is one of the most negative examples of cohabitations of space because of the type of demography that you have there. In the Jewish quarter, you have very religious Jews, some of them very nationalistic, living there, and in a way it works like a kind of a settlement. When you see the discourse around these people, they're talking about the Judaization of the old city. On the other hand, you have the Palestinian Muslims, the Palestinian Christians that try to hold on and see their own presence in this place as trying to safeguard the holy sites and the Muslim or the Christian character of the city. And at least in the survey that I did, I discovered that the more religious people were in answering those surveys on both sides, the more negative kind of attitudes they presented towards space mixing, towards the encounter, and etc. So I know there is a notion that interfaith collaboration can lead to some kind of new possibilities, but what I saw that the people who interacted in the most positive way were actually the more secular people on both sides. And the old city, it's a very religious, very sensitive space.
Hi, first, thank you for coming and talking. I just had a question about how you thought these illegal settlements in Palestinian territories have kind of fostered or promoted this sort of forced mingling between the two communities.
So you're asking about the settlements in East Jerusalem, not in the West Bank. So first of all, they are very different from the settlements in the West Bank, because in the West Bank, you're talking about gated communities which are very close and that have their own kind of networking and segregation. In East Jerusalem, we're talking about urban space, which is much more fluid in essence. You can control who's come where, not even like transients, but they're also not in the sense of who's buying apartment where, essentially. So it makes, in a way, it creates a platform for much more kind of daily mixings than the settlement. But only until recently, you wouldn't see Palestinians moving into those Jewish settlements. This is quite a new phenomenon, and we're talking about middle upper classes, either Israeli Palestinians or sometimes East Jerusalemite Palestinians. And then, of course, you have much more intimate kind of positions in where those people find themselves. But generally speaking, yes, the fact that Israel tries to Judaize East Jerusalem has its inner paradox because it creates the conditions for kind of more mixing. But if you're talking about an encounter between an ideological settler and a local Palestinian, we're talking about mostly a very negative encounter. When you're talking about two people who move to those neighborhoods just to kind of upgrade their life conditions, not out of ideology, because most of Jews living in those neighborhoods are just moved there because it's cheap, then we discuss something which is a bit different.
Hi. So you mentioned that your case studies focus on geography and even between different class systems, but I'm curious if you had any case studies that focused on like different generations, and if so, like what have you found?
So I can tell you some insight that I had about the generational thing. I didn't find any kind of consistency in that. Sometimes you have older generation Palestinians, for example, who remember Jerusalem before Oslo Accord, before 87, when there was a more free movement between Israel and the West Bank, and they look at it as this kind of glorious times. And in many cases, those people would be kind of more, I would say, more tolerant, or more, if you can say tolerant from Palestinian position, but kind of more moderate or less nationalistic. And then you have more young people who are, because of their age, more kind of heated up and that. So I didn't find any consistency. But one generational thing that there is the issue of the culture, the globalization and culture of consumption. Because those young people who work at the shops, they're not just working together. In many cases, they also share kind of cultural attributes. Like, you know, they would listen to the same music, they would dress the same. Their at least external differences are much lower than the older generation. When you look at pictures of Jerusalem at the 80s, you usually would see Palestinians with kafia, wearing more traditional clothes, and Jews there was quite external difference, and now it's been more kind of fading, this kind of, and I think it's a generational thing. And this neoliberal idea that, you know, you put yourself first, and you progress in life by realizing yourself, works also towards creating a more kind of mutual ground. Again, and I'm saying it not in a judgmental way. If you look at it from a national Palestinian point of view, you're talking about normalization in a way. With people putting forth their own identities and leave behind their collective in a way, maybe temporarily, maybe not, but it happens.
I'm not sure that I'll be able to vocalize what I want to. I worked in Palestine 5 years off and on with a peace team, and I saw tremendous suffering. And I think it's interesting to look at the situation academically, but it might be a little bit like the apartheid in South Africa, or the situation of tremendous racism in this country, that somehow I think, as an Israeli, maybe I'm excusing myself in this, but I think there has to be an admitting of the oppression that's going on there day after day. That the suffering to me was overwhelming. And it just wasn't once in a while, it was all of the time. To go from Bet Sahur to Jerusalem to work, for your family to survive, you were punished every day. Children were taken near Nablus and put in prison in solitary confinement. So almost every family was touched by this kind of oppression. And to me, you just can't talk about the situation academically. There has to be some kind of change. I recently read a book, and you may know this person. I think his name is Abram Berg. He wrote In a Day Ahead, I think, or Days Ahead. And he sees himself changing. And he goes on both sides. But the risk that people have to take on the side of Israel has to be more than what it is. Palestinians die, some 100 to 4 sometimes, compared to what Israelis do. So there has to be, I think, when you come to this country and talk, you can't just do the academic. You have to talk about the oppression.
Any questions? I'd like to ask a final question, if I may. You mentioned the Jerusalem master plan, and you talked about it. I think one of the most sort of compelling things about the master plan is that it also has sort of a specification as to what percentage of the city should be Jewish versus non-Jewish, meaning Palestinian. What impact does that have on these sort of shared spaces, and what happens when the demographics shift in such a way that perhaps more than 40% of the city is Jewish? Or Palestinian, rather.
So yeah, I'll try to relate both to what you said and also answer that. So I don't know which one first, because it kind of takes me to all sorts of directions. So of course, I understand the remark about my positioning in this situation and this relationship between academic work and political work. Now, I made my choice. And this is my field of study of the city. And I don't consider myself as a scholar of the occupation. There is a lot of work done on the occupation in a way, in parallel, which I use and utilize to understand. And I did focus on some spheres that were, because of what you said, quite neglected in the work, because there's a lot of work done on oppression and etc. But I also think it's important. You can say academically it's important because it's neglected and etc. and it should be investigated, but that's not my point. I also think it's politically important, especially in the situation in which we today, which looks like a kind of zero-sum game, and we are only deteriorating more and more, and hope is becoming kind of almost inaccessible. And I do find in those situations seeds of hope. Now, not in a way that will normalize the Israeli occupation eventually, or justify it, or trying to show that actually Palestinians also have normal life in Jerusalem. That's not my point. But I think there is hope in it, and this goes to your question, because it's undermining the Israeli strategies in the city in many ways. Because on one hand, what Israel tried to achieve in Jerusalem, they wanted the control of the territory, and they wanted Judaization. And the segregation was also a very important part of this strategy, right? To create this Jewish city with demographic dominance, and until today in official documents, you would find those aims of 70% Jews, 30% Arabs. It has failed this in the demography-wise. And we see those inner contradictions in the Israeli strategies in East Jerusalem. And I think that if we look at this process of spatial mixing, which is kind of forced on the Palestinians, and this integration into the labor market, and eventually, and if it will continue uninterruptedly in large masses, I think it will change the political position of Palestinians within the city. Eventually, it will create a better ground for the political claims, because today they have to face in all fronts their social, not only their political oppression, but also socio-economic marginalization. The fact that there are 30% dropouts and etc. creates much less opportunities for them to oppose the occupation and fights toward it. So I actually think that it's kind of paradoxical, but through this pragmatic Israelization, there is a chance for a stronger political reaction afterwards. And we do find out that many people, even Muslims and etc., even if they go through Western universities and etc., it doesn't kind of decrease their loyalty eventually. In many ways, it really can reinforce it. So this is kind of, if I look politically of what I'm doing, I think it's also significant into trying to achieve more justice and peace in our region in a way, but not trying, and I apologize if I kind of withstand the realities of the occupation, but this was not the purpose of this lecture. It was highlighting other aspects.
Well, thank you very much for coming, and thank you all very much for coming. And if you want to, Dr. Shtern will be here. You can come ask him more questions.
All right.